Okay, we're reaching towards the end of Yevamot, actually. Figure it'll be another either 3 or 4 sessions. Right after Pesach, pretty much, we'll actually finish the Yaakov on Yevamot, or at least the sections I wanted to do. And then we can move to another Masechet and do the second half of the year with a different Masechet of roughly the same length of Yaakov. So, it's been about 6 months for Yevamot, and then we'll move to a different topic. I'm thinking Avodah Zarah, so stay tuned. But we're towards the end now of the Ein Yaakov compilation of Agadot on Masechet Yevamot. And so on Daf Kuf Gimel, it discusses something that actually comes up in other places in Shas as well. We'll see in Nazir and Daf Chaf Gimel. And then in the Midrashei Rabbah, it's discussed. In regards to the story of Yael and Sisera. So, just if we quickly refresh our memory of the story. So there's a battle with Barak and Dvorah against Sisera. And Sisera flees the battle. He goes to the tent of Yael. So we'll read the psukim inside in a minute just to get a refresher. But basically we'll see that there's conflicting midrashim on how to understand what happened, because the actual story is a bit vague. And then we'll look at how the Mefarshim on the Ein Yaakov try to understand the discrepancy between the midrashim and discuss more generally maybe other midrashim that relate to these midrashim. We'll see kind of the different ways to look at the story. So just to refresh our memory of what happens in Sefer Shoftim, so in Perek Daled, so after Barak and Dvorah overwhelm the enemy, Barak chases after the chariot that Sisera flees, and Barak chases after him. So we're told Sisera nas beraglav el oel Yael eshet chever hakeni ki shalom ben Yavin melech Hatzor uven beit chever hakeni. There was a truce or an alliance or some peace between the king of Hatzor, right? Sisera was fighting on behalf of Hatzor, and the house of Chever Hakeni. Yael was the wife of Chever Hakeni. So they had an alliance. So Sisera fled there, presumably to seek refuge. ותצא יעל לקראת סיסרא, ותאמר אליו סורה אדוני סורה אלי, אל תירא, ויסר אליה האוהלה, ותכסהו בשמיכה. So Yael comes out to greet Sisera, and she says to him, come, turn towards me, don't be afraid. He turns to her, and she covers him with a smicha. And we'll see what that means. ויאמר אליה השקיני נא מעט מים, כי צמאתי, he's thirsty from battle, ותפתח את נוד החלב, ותשקהו ותכסהו. So she opens up, instead he asked for water, she gives him milk, and she gives him the milk, and she covers him. Right? So if we stopped at this point in the story, and this will become relevant later on, if we just read these 3 psukim, it doesn't seem at all clear that Yael has ill intentions here. Right? That there's a peace treaty between Yael's family, clan, and Sisera's nation. He's fleeing battle. She brings him inside. He asks for some water, and she gives him some milk. Right? The straightforward way to understand that is that she's providing him refuge in accordance with the agreement between their respective peoples. And then he asks for water, so she gives him milk, because perhaps that's even better, but certainly nothing nefarious. But then we see the continuation of the story. ויאמר אליה עמוד פתח האוהל, והיה אם איש יבוא שאלך, ואמר היש פה איש, ואמרת אין. So he asks her to stand guard, and basically to keep away anyone who would come looking after him. ותיקח יעל אשת חבר את יתד האוהל, ותשם את המקבת בידה, ותבוא אליו בלט, ותתקע את היתד ברקתו, ותצנח בארץ, והוא נרדם ויעל וימות. Basically, she stabs him in the skull and kills him. Adkan. Okay, so Yael, after he falls asleep from the milk that she gave him, she sneaks up on him and kills him while he's sleeping. So, again, kind of what I was alluding to, which is that there seems to be this abrupt change. We don't understand Yael's motives, essentially. Why does she kill Sisera? Especially given the fact that their peoples had a peace treaty, and if you read the few psukim before she kills him, you would be under the impression that she's trying to protect him. So, let's see. The Gemara in Yevamot Daf Kuf Gimel Amud Aleph teaches as follows. Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Sheva בעילות בעל אותו רשע באותו היום. So, אותו רשע here is referring to Sisera. It says that he did 7 acts of בעילות. He basically raped Yael 7 times on that day. Shneemar, in the Shirat Dvorah, which is in the next parak, talking about the whole episode. So as it's praising Yael, it says, Ben raglea kara nafal, shachav ben raglea, kara nafal, ba'asher kara, sham nafal shadud. So it repeats the same, it's poetic, but it repeats this language of kara, nafal, shachav, that each of those is a euphemism for lying with her. So it says a word of that. It says kara, nafal, shachav, kara, nafal, kara, nafal. So it says 7 times. So Rabbi Yochanan understands from that he forcefully took her 7 times. The Gemara asks, "V'haka mitanya me'avera," and the Gemara says, "So why is Yael praised?" In other words, if they slept together, that's still something that's enjoyable for her on some level. So why is she considered? Sorry, I jumped the gun a little bit. It doesn't necessarily mean that he took her forcefully, just that they had relations, they slept together. So the Gemara says, "V'aka mitanya me'avera," but wouldn't she have benefited or enjoyed that, right? So why are we praising her so much? Amar Rabbi Yochanan Mishum ben Yochai, Kol tovatan shel ra'ahi etzel tzadikim. Anything that's good for the wicked is wicked for the righteous. Shneemar, we're told in the story of Yaakov when he's fleeing from Lavan, Hashem comes to Lavan and says to him, Hishamer lecha pen tedaber im Yaakov mitov ad ra. God warns Lavan not to say anything to Yaakov, mitov ad ra. So the Gemara says, Bishlam ara. I can understand why God would tell Lavan not to say anything or do anything ra to Yaakov. But Ela tova, my lo, why can't he do something good or say something good to him? So Ela shmamina tovatan shel Rashaim merahi etzel tzadikim. So learn from here that even what's considered good for the Rashaim, like Lavan, is considered evil to the righteous. The righteous don't even benefit from what the wicked consider good. And so too here in this story, that Yael didn't enjoy the interactions that she had with Sisera, so we don't say that it was something that was enjoyable for her, and therefore we praise her for the acts that she did. The Gemara continues, Bishlama hatam dilma midkar le shema de avodat kochavim. Ela hacha mayra ika. So the Gemara says, well, now you're drawing a comparison between Yaakov and Lavan and Sisera and Rachel. But there's a difference. How can you do that? Because over there, I can understand why the good that Lavan would think is good is wicked for Yaakov. Because maybe Lavan would swear in the name of his God, or do something, a feast in the name of his God, or something in the name of his God, because Lavan was all worked up about Lama ganaftem et Elohai. So they were talking about the gods, so Lavan's gods. So that we can understand why Yaakov would interpret what was in Lavan's eyes as good, something having to do with God, his gods, as bad in Yaakov's eyes. But Elahachi Ma'ira'ika, like what is bad in this instance with Yael and Sisera? At the end of the day, it's a pleasurable physical experience. So the Kashadi Bazu Hamas. So the Gemara answers it's because he poisoned her with sensual lust. The Amar Rabbi Yochanan b'sha'a sheba nachash al chava hitil bazu hama. So when the snake slept with Chava, which obviously isn't in itself a whole midrash, but the idea is that the snake at the time lay with Chava, and they gave birth to all these demons, etc. So he infected her with this thing called zuhama, which is this lust, this uncontrollable urge to have relations. Yisrael she'amdu al har Sinai paskazu ma'atan, ovdei kochavim shelo amdu al har Sinai lo paskazu hamatan. So, and he claims here that once Bnei Israel stood at Har Sinai, so among other things, this zuhama that mankind had been cursed with was lifted or was removed, but the nations who did not stand at Har Sinai, this zuhama was not removed, and so therefore Yael and Sisera was able to poison Yael with this zuhama, which was not enjoyable for her. In other words, that she had this level of lust that she didn't have beforehand. Okay, so I don't want to talk too much about this idea of the zuhama and kind of it's a whole world in and of itself. But what we're more concerned with today is the way that this Gemara, Rabbi Yochanan, is trying to understand the story of Yael and Sisera, is saying that the reason why Yael ends up killing Sisera is, the motive here is pretty clear, in that he slept with her 7 times, like he took advantage of her, let's say. So that's something that wouldn't be enjoyable for her, and that motivated her to go and strike him down. And so we understand Yael's motive. The problem with this is that it explicitly seems to contradict a different Gemara in Nazir, Daf Chav Gimel Amud Bet. Excuse me. Actually, let's read it in Vayikra Rabbah, because it's a bit of a different version. Vayikra Rabbah, Perek Chav Gimel, Piska Yud. It says as follows: Shlosha hem shebarchu min ha'avera, v'shitef HaKadosh Baruch Hu shmo imahem. Ve'elu hen Yosef ve'elu palti. There were three people who fled from sin, and the context here is sexual immorality. And so as a reward, God connected his name with them. Okay, Yosef, Yael, and Palti. We won't discuss Yosef and Palti, but Yael minayin, where do you learn from Yael? So Shneimar, we're told, Vatetzei El likrat Sisera vatchaseu basmicha. So it says she went out to greet him and she covered him with a smicha. Ma'u basmicha, what is a smicha? So Rabbanan dehacha amrei besudara. So the rabbis here in Bavel say sudar, which is like a blanket or a sheet, which is kind of how smicha and man in Hebrew. Rabbanan detaman amrei bim shichla, which I don't remember what that means, but not a blanket. See what that means quickly. It means a bowl, that she covered him with a bowl. Amar Reish Lakish says, Chazarnu al kol hamikra, v'lo matzinu kli sheshmo smicha. He says the word smicha doesn't appear elsewhere. Right? This is kind of a unique occurrence. So he uses that as license to interpret it differently. He says, Umas smicha, what does it mean? Shmi ko. It's spelled with a shin, or sin, instead of a samech. Shmi ko. I split into two words. My name is here. Shmi me'id aleh shelo naga ba'oto rasha. That my name is here, that Yael maintained sexual purity, and that particular man, in other words, Sisera, did not touch her. And she killed him because he was wicked, let's say. So obviously this seems to go against what we just read in Yevamot, which doesn't only say that Naga Ba'oto Rasha, but that they did it 7 times, right? So which is it? So before we look at the Mefarshim and how they try to deal with this, I just want to read the Gemara Nazir on Chav Gimel Amud Bet, which sheds a little bit more light on this discussion. Amar Rabbi Nachman bar Yitzchak, Gdola avera lishma mimitzvah shelo lishma. So Rabbi Nachman bar Yitzchak says, it's better to sin for the right reasons than to do the right thing for the wrong reasons. Which is, in and of itself, a fascinating discussion. Like, which is better, right? The intention or the act? Which is more important? So Rabbi Nachman bar Yitzchak here claims that it's better, the intent is more important than the actual act. It's better if you do something wrong for the right reasons than right for the wrong reasons. The Gemara objects. Ve'amar Rabbi Yehuda amar Rav la'olam ya'asok adam b'torah u'mitzvot afilu shelo lishman, because this is a famous idea. Shemitoch shelo lishman ba lishman. Right, a person should always engage himself with Torah and mitzvot, even if he's not doing it for the right reasons, because then he will build within himself behaviorally a yearning for those things, and it will become part of what he does, and so then it will come to be done for the right reasons. So how can you reconcile that with what we just taught, that it's better to sin for the right reasons than to do a mitzvah for the wrong reasons? Because even doing a mitzvah for the wrong reasons means I will eventually do them for the right reasons. So rather reinterpret Rav Yitzchak as saying not that a sin for the right reasons is better than a mitzvah for the wrong reasons, but that it's similar to a mitzvah for the wrong reasons. But a mitzvah for the right reasons is obviously better than either of them. And he says, how do we know this? It says in Shoftim, Tevorach minashim Yael eshet chaver hakenim minashim ba'oel tevorach. This is from Shirat Torah, Dvorah, right? That Yael eshet chaver hakeni, she should be blessed minashim, from the women. Minashim ba'ohel, the women in the tent. Who are they? Man nashim sheba'ohel, Sarah Rivka chavalea, the imahot. So she should be blessed like the imahot. Amar Rav Yochanan, Sheva בעילות בעילות rasha באותה שעה, שנאמר, da. Amar Rav Yochanan, kol tov, and then it quotes basically the Gemara that we have in Yevamot, pretty similarly. Okay, so here it also just relates, this will become relevant later on in the comments of the Yun Yaakov, to the bracha of Dvorah, where she says, Tevorach minashim Yael, eshet chaver hakini, minashim ba'oel tevorach. what is the relationship between the blessing that Yael receives, which compares her to Sarif Karchev Leah, to perhaps the machloket between the midrashim that we just saw about whether Yael was sexually pure or was not during this incident. So let's,
Ron, was Yael Jewish?
So no, she wasn't Jewish. Yeah.
Right, because then that saying that I know you don't want to get into the Zuhama, right? But it said like Sisera infected her with the Zuhama, which she presumably didn't have beforehand. But if she was part of the Yevamot Olam that didn't stand on her Sinai and have it taken away from them, then how did she not have it already? Kind of thing.
Yeah. I didn't want to get into that. It's a good question.
Yeah, right.
It's a good question. I mean, it kind of begs itself. You're right. On a midrashic level, who is Chever Akeni, right? So there's a tradition that it was the descendants of Yitro, and Yitro converted. So maybe Yael was Jewish. But I think maybe Rashi addresses that. I don't remember exactly what the reason is, but it's a good question. After we finish, we'll look into it for a second if you want to stay on that, because it does kind of ask itself.
Is there any, when they're talking about sinning for the right reason, could that refer to Yael committing murder, but for the right reason?
Well, that's the whole idea. How do we know that Avera Lishma is like a mitzvah shelo Lishma? How do we know that sinning for the right reasons is like a mitzvah? From the fact that Yael was given this bracha which compares her to Sarif Karchev Leah. So it's clear that what she did is considered praiseworthy. So even though she committed murder, she did it for the right reasons, presumably, and so it's considered a good thing. It's like a mitzvah. So that's the idea there.
If we're just looking at the pshat for a second at the Shirat Devorah, what I think they're really doing is they're mocking Sisera. His mother is bragging about how he's going to have all this victory and have all this plunder and women and all that, and they're making a mockery of his conquest of a woman, falling between her legs, but he didn't fall sexually between her legs, he dropped dead between her legs. So they're taking that image of sexual conquest and turning it on its head. That's the pshat. Right.
Which I think is how Vayikor Rabba understands it, that, right, Lo naga ba'oto rasha, that she managed to kill him and stay pure. And then that's how this is understood. And Rabbi Yochanan understands it differently. Right. Yep. Okay, good questions. So, what do we do with these two midrashim that conflict with each other pretty explicitly? So, I think we talked about, Abba, you asked a question about this a few weeks ago, about how Achronim deal with midrashim, Agadic midrashim that explicitly contradict, and if they're comfortable with that. And so here we have another example, right? So you have the Eitz Yosef, where he says, Agada zu choleket al zeh di'ita b'Vayikor Rabba b'perak chaf gimel. di'ita sham shmi me'id alea shelo naga ba'oto rasha. וכן כתב בעל לב אהרון, וכן כתב היפת תואר. וסיים שאין טעם לפרש שלא נגע בה להנאתה, שהיא לא נתקווה, אלא... Okay. Basically, he says, ועין בכלי יקר על something שנדחק גם כן ליישב. He says, a lot of different opinions agree that these two agadot just contradict each other. And he says, but you can look at the Kli Yakar, who tries very much to figure out a way to resolve them. The Rif, also in his commentary on Yevamot, actually also tries to resolve them. So he says as follows. And it's also, I would say, nidchak, but it's an interesting approach. So he says, Sheva בעילות בעל אותו רשע. So he says, וקשה מה שדרשו אהבת חסר בסמיכה, שמי כה מעיד עליה, שלא נגע בה אותו רשע. Right? So he says it's difficult, this Gemara, which says that Sisera and Yael were together 7 times, which contradicts the one that interprets smicha to be shmi ko, that my name testifies that they didn't sleep together. V'dochak lomar shehem midrashim chalukim. So the Rif has a different approach. He says, you can't just say that they're contradictory midrashim. We don't like to say that. Which the Eitz Yosef had no problem saying. V'yesh mi shepiresh shelo ba'al otam. So I think what he actually, I'll just do kind of a spoiler alert, what the Rif develops here is a pretty novel reading of the psukim in Shoftim, informed by an attempt to resolve the contradiction between these two midrashim. So he says as follows: ויש מי שפירש שלא בעל אותה ממש, רק מתוך שכרותו. היה דומה לו שבעלה, והוא שוכב בין רגליה, ועדיין אין דרשה זו מוסמכת לדבריהם, שדרשו גדולה עבירה לשמה, עוד אמרו, והכה מתהניה מעבירה. Okay, that's not important. והנר לעניות דעתי, בדקדוק הכתובים שכתוב ותחסהו בסמיכה, וחזר לומר ותשקהו ותחסהו ולא כתיב בסמיכה. So if we go back to the psukim, the Rif is saying, first when he comes to her house, right, she brings him in, ותאמר אליו סורה, אדוני סורה אלי אל תירא, ויסר אליה האוהלה ותחסהו בסמיכה. He first comes into her tent, she covers him with the smicha. Right? Then what happens? He says, please give me some water. She gives him some milk. He gets drunk or tired from the milk. Vatchasehu. And she covers him. It doesn't say what she covered him with. The first time it said she covered him with a blanket. Then it goes in again, says, and she covered him. So why the repetition? And why is the smicha missing the second time? So what the Rif says, Al ken ani omer, Yael amra Sisera, Sura Adoni Sura Elai Al Tira. And when she first calls him aside to her tent, She'akavana lomar Sura Shelo Tigabi. Right? Uvitnai zeh Sura Elai Al Tira. In other words, come to my tent, I'll protect you, but don't touch me. Right? Don't take advantage of me. That's the condition that I'm going to allow you to come seek refuge. Vayasar elea ha'ohela. And that's what happened. He went towards her tent with that condition. Shelo yigaba, that she wouldn't touch her. Vatchaseu basmicha. And then the pasuk says she covered him with the smicha, because at that point shmi ko meida shelo nagabo ota sha'a. That at that point the understanding between them was, I'll provide you with refuge, because I guess there's a treaty between our peoples, and that we're nothing's going to happen here. And so, vatchaseu basmicha, like she covered with the smicha. In other words, God came and attested to the fact that everything was done in purity. Aval kishesha'al mimena achar kach hashkini na me'at mayim ki tzameti. Then Sisera asks her, can I have some water because I'm thirsty? Uvevo'a elav im hamayim hichzik ba ube'ala sheva בעילות. But then Sisera reneged that he tried to figure out a way to take her anyway, even though he had agreed to come in, and so that's why it's important that we have this narrative of, he says, please, can I have some water? And then she goes to get him water, and then when she comes back, he takes advantage of her. And that ties in the midrash of the 7 בעילות. ואז כתיב, ותשקהו ותחסהו, ולא כתיב בסמיכה. And then it says that she fed him, that she gave him some milk to drink and covered him, but it doesn't say that she covered him with a smicha, right? Lefishe be'ota sha'a ba'aleh, because in that moment it wasn't bismicha, because shmiko was no longer relevant, because they had actually slept together. Ulezeh harga oto Yael al shebagad. The reason Yael killed him was because he reneged on the agreement that they had made at the beginning, where she said that I'll give you refuge on the condition that you don't do what he ended up doing. Right? V'zeu shekatuv ben raglea kara shacha v'chulei. And that's why in Shirat Dvar, when it says kasher kara sham nafal shadud, right? Where he was lying, that's where he fell. Shekavana lomar she'al po'el rasha asher asa v'kara lishkav ima lekach nafal shadud sheharagto Yael umechza v'chalfa kato. That the idea being that because he lay with her, that's why he fell. That the way that the Rif understands the story, with like a pretty precise reading of the psukim, is differently than we had understood it before, right? That initially we said, according to the pshat, that right, she provided him with some refuge, and that for reasons that aren't necessarily so clear to us, she ends up killing him. So either we could have understood it like the Gemara in Nazir, that she killed him even though nothing happened between them, and she killed him just because he was Rasha and she was righteous for whatever reason, or because that they had all these relations together and he raped her and then she killed him. But the Rif tries to combine them and say, no, the first half is talking about when the smicha, shmiko, that she actually did not have any intentions to kill him. She had intentions to protect him. But then when he turned on her and he took advantage of her, then she resolved in that moment to kill him. And that's when the shmiko no longer applied. So that's how the Rif attempts to resolve the potential contradiction between these two midrashim. And with a pretty sharp reading of the psukim, the Eitz Yosef, along with the other mifarshim that he comments, feels more comfortable just saying that these are two different ways of understanding the psukim.
But that reading of the Rif doesn't really work, I don't think, with that the other bit that we saw, which said that Yael was given a bracha like the Imahot, because and maybe she's not tzaddikas either. Like, she's just a taken advantage woman, got her revenge, rather than seeing Sisera as a Sonei Yisrael and killing him.
I think you're right. In other words, this Gemara, or in Nazir, when it understands that they didn't touch each other and she killed him just because he was a Rasha, and that's where the bracha of Tevarach Minashim Yael comes from. So you're right. That's kind of painting Yael in this light of just, she killed Sisera not out of any revenge or any disgust, but just because he was wicked and she wanted to do right by Bnei Israel for whatever reason. The Rif's understanding, he's on the one hand, he's not really relating to the Gemara in Nazir here. He's relating to Vayikra Rabbah saying that Shmiko, and he's relating to the Gemara in Yevamot, which says Sheva Be'ilot. But I think you're right. It's a bit of a harder reading with the way the bracha is understood. It's not necessarily so clear how to understand the bracha with his reading at all. In other words, if she just did it because he reneged on her agreement, so it wasn't a bad thing that she did. It was probably still a good thing that she did. She did an avera lishma, but why does that merit such a effusive bracha? But then again, according to Rabbi Yochanan, how do we understand this bracha? I don't think the Gemara in Yevamot understands that. In other words, if they slept together 7 times, so why is she tivarach minashim Yael? So it could be that just the fact that she killed Sisera, even if the motive behind it was wrapped up in taking revenge or doing something based on what had happened to her personally, it's still a praiseworthy act that she did, that she had the courage to kill him. But
why? You said something problematic there, maybe, as in, like, if the assumption is that she was raped, then why is it even a question? Like, why is it a question that she's doing something lo lishma? Right? She wasn't enjoying it, in theory.
Well,
do you see what I mean?
Right.
1 second.
Yeah, go ahead. And the Gemara in Yevamot says that it asks that question, right? That something, the fact that it was the zuhama means that she didn't enjoy it, but apparently even if you're raped, it can be in some way enjoyable. It's kind of the assumption there.
Who's that? Not particularly modern understanding of things.
Just in the pure physical sense. I mean, it's kind of the...
Okay.
I think tzarich iyun on the interpretation of Rabbi Yochanan. I think it requires more explanation than the Vayikra Rabbah, which is ironic because usually, kind of here is the reverse. If we kind of put on the more modern lens of how we would look at this sort of thing, usually the medrash that says, it's like tzaddikim and rashaim, and it whitewashes everything and says that that people did things just because they had like only the purest of motives. So usually that's kind of the simpler approach, but also kind of the more simplistic approach. And normally we would say, no, really, Rabbi Yochanan is trying to be a bit more truthful to the pshat of, obviously there was something more going on here. But by introducing the fact that they slept together into the story, first of all, it's actually not in the pshat with Yael. It doesn't say that they did that. It does explain her motives, but it introduces other questions, like you mentioned, like why then in Shirat Dvorah does she praise Yael so much? So it's kind of, the two different ways of understanding this, like they each resolve different aspects of the psukim in better ways, and it leaves other aspects of the psukim more open to kind of the questions. You kind of have the interplay of Shirat Dvorah with the narrative of the actual story, and then you have to kind of figure out how those work together. I don't know.
I have a question. So looking at it maybe more from a literary perspective, there's another character who plays a somewhat similar role, and that would be Rahav, who is actually, described as an Isha Zonah. But, she covers the spies and gives them shelter and everything. And there's, I don't know what the Midrashim are on that whole episode, but presumably she didn't have sexual relations with them. But like Yael, perhaps, she saw she had the foresight to understand that, she wants to bet on the right horse here. And she believes, for whatever reasons, both women see the political reality, the military political reality of their time, and they go with Bnei Israel. So these two women play these pivotal roles in these moments of great danger. And it's very, very interesting that there's some certain similarities between the two characters.
Yeah, and that's a whole other way to look at all this. That what's motivating Yael isn't revenge over being taken advantage of, and what's motivating her isn't that Sisera was a Rasha, but just that she was being a pragmatic she was just trying to do what she thought was the best move for whoever was at that moment winning the war, which was Bnei Israel. So she, like you said, was betting on the right horse. That's a different way to read all of this.
That was my comment. My question is, so we've encountered this a couple times, but it kind of hit me today more than before. So if we're like just looking at Chumash, let's say, right? So all different generations of Chazal want to make sure as best that they can that there are no contradictions within the text, right? That almost goes without saying. And on the other hand, if you look at, like, say, much later on when they are Mefarshim, you could have your Perush and I could have my Perush, and they can be contradictory, right? But as long as your Perush reconciles the text and my Perush reconciles the text, we're okay. The fact that you and I disagree or contradict each other isn't a problem. Now, in between those two layers, we have Midrash. So it's not quite clear to me, since Midrash is Bechozda, not Pshat, why, when they go to such great lengths to reconcile conflicting Midrashim, is it for sport, or they really have a problem with that?
Katonti, but I wouldn't say it's for.
I'm wondering what your thought is on that question.
I wouldn't say it's for sport. I would say drosh v'kabel schar is the motivation. That the more you are mipalpel different interpretations and trying to understand the different approaches and how to resolve them, that you're osek bit Torat Elokim Chaim. Like that's a holy endeavor, and it develops.
Where my difficulty is, there's an implied assumption that two midrashim cannot contradict each other, which is a very high standard, just a high bar to set for a midrash,
So again, I think first of all, we saw explicitly that there are opinions that don't, right? Even Achronim, which is relatively late in the game, that don't necessarily feel that that's a requirement. You're right that the Rif said that it's dachuk to say that they contradict, and he tries to offer a different interpretation. the way I would try to understand, I don't think they're coming at it from saying it can't be that these midrashim can't conflict. They're coming at it from an approach of trying to understand it better. Like, you try to see these different traditions, you understand where they're coming from, you try to build through trying to either reconcile them or understand them more deeply. You develop a deeper appreciation and understanding of what's going on and the different approaches, right? If you just kind of always left every contradiction as, okay, they contradict, then there would be a lot of more rich understanding that would go uninvestigated and unexplored. So, I'm inclined to kind of frame it in that light. But yeah, and it's also not necessarily true that just because two like Rishonim say contradictory things that like you don't try to resolve them. I'm sure there's situations where like a Rishon says something, another Rishon says another, and then later rabbis try to reconcile them, even though they're just Rishonim. I mean, of course, there's plenty of instances where they argue on each other, but what's always motivating this is to try to come up with something that's cohesive. I think. I don't know. I don't really have too much to say on that, but it's a good question. I think this is a good example where two midrashim pretty clearly contradict each other, and you can kind of take the Rif's approach. And the reason I like it is that what's motivating him is clearly trying to resolve these two midrashim. Like, he doesn't like the fact, he says explicitly, he doesn't like the fact that they contradict. But actually, what he does by resolving them is sharpen what's motivating each midrash individually. In other words, by reading them back into the psukim and causing that very kind of being very mikdakdik and placing each of them in its proper place, he helps draw out more fully what each midrash was trying to do to begin with. And I think that's interesting in and of its own right. Yeah.
Is there like a Beis Hillel, Beis Shammai of midrashim?
Not that I know of. I know in the Midrash Rabbah, there's a lot of machlokot between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Nechemia. Like, all the time, the two of them are taking different approaches, but I don't know if there's something as kind of, as Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai.
We'll call them machlokot at the midrashic level. Have you noticed, like, thematically, is there something that's kind of consistent in one of their approaches and the other versus the others, or is it just, they like to disagree?
It's something I wanted to actually explore at some point. Was Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Nechemia specifically, kind of if there's some thread that unites there. I mean, the most obvious way to divide midrashic machlokot is between a more pshat-oriented and a more midrash-oriented approach, right? Like, what's a good example? The beginning of Shmot, right? It says, Vayamot melech Mitzrayim, Vayakom melech chadash al Mitzrayim asher lo yada et Yosef, right? So one says it was a new king, and one says that it was the same one who deliberately tried to forget Yosef, right? So, kind of like, one of them is pshat. It's just the king died. He says, all right, the midrash is the pshat, it's fine. The other one is trying to trying to say, no, we forgot about Yosef. In other words, the idea behind we're starting new Sefer Shmot, we're starting Vayakom Melech Hadash, it's a new era, right? The reign of Yosef is over. What Yosef managed to accomplish is that's all gone. Now we're talking about a new phase where Bnei Israel have fallen from being favored to slaves, etc., etc. It's kind of more thematic. Hey, this is all a tangent. I'm going to stop the recording.